with presenters Mustafa Sarkar and Paul Morgan. I'd like to tell you a little bit about today's webinar and what you can expect. If you could just change the slide for me there. Right. For people who've not been on a BASES webinar before, it's produced jointly by BASES, the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, and Human Kinetics. It's scheduled to last for about an hour, of which 45 minutes will be the presentation itself, followed by a Q&A session. Both of those will be quite fluid, really. If it finishes early, more questions; finishes late, probably less questions. But we'll keep the questions being answered as long as you can keep them coming, really. It will be recorded for playback at a later date, and you will receive an email containing the link when the recording's available. It'll either be tomorrow, I would guess, or Monday. Your microphones are muted just so that we don't get too many interruptions. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to the presenters, could you please enter it in the panel at the bottom right-hand corner and click send. I'll be monitoring these throughout the presentation. Some of them will be I'll be able to answer myself. Others I'll put to the panelists at the end. Normally, we have far more questions than we possibly answer, and I will apologise in advance now that we won't probably get through all that we have already. But please keep them coming, and we will get through as many as we can. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about today's presenters. In addition to what you see on the screen there, for the past 5 years, Mustafa and Paul have been conducting research with Dr. David Fletcher in the areas of psychological and team resilience, respectively. They've published their work in numerous international peer-reviewed journals and presented their findings at various national and international conferences. Based on the research, in this webinar they will share some of their thoughts and experiences of developing resilience in practice. So I'd now like to hand you over to the presenters, Mustafa and Paul.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you to BASES and Human Kinetics for inviting Paul and I to present today. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in to listen as well. What I'm going to do on the, just to give a bit of an introduction to the webinar, in the first kind of part of the webinar, we're going to just talk a little bit about what is resilience. The point of that really is to, it's very difficult to develop resilience if you don't know what it is, and that's kind of the idea about it. Not to give any academic type definitions, but do it in a way where we can find out a little bit more about what this area is all about. In the second section, which is really going to form the main part of the webinar, we're going to propose a resilience training program for elite athletes and teams. Talking about three main areas. It will cover those three areas using some of our research as a bit of an example. And kind of we appreciate we've got a variety of different people in terms of listening, so hopefully we'll have that balance between some of the research that we've done, but also some of our applied experiences as well. And in the final section, Paul's going to talk about implementing resilience training in practice. And hopefully we're going to be doing that as well throughout the whole webinar, but that particular last section is actually some of our thoughts of actually what can you do in the real world about that, and Paul will cover that slightly towards the end as well. So before we actually start going with that particular content, we're just going to give you a few example quotes from the media to illustrate the importance of resilience and to showcase it in the real world in sport and business.
And welcome everybody to this webinar. My name's Paul Morgan. Well, resilience has certainly become a hot topic, and we think it's very much about enabling people to withstand the hurdles they face and being able to manage change effectively in a proactive manner. So to illustrate, on the slide you have here, this article was written by a business psychologist who happened to be seeing many traumatized patients being made redundant from the city in finance, and it was clear that many were weathering the recession more effectively than others. And so the notion of change is a really central theme of resilience, and we live in a fast-changing world, increasing demands on parents, families, businesses and society at large. So we feel it's becoming an ever-important asset to be able to deal effectively with the inevitable setbacks that we all face in life. And I suppose while resilience has become a hot topic, actually resilience research did start over 50 years ago with work by Norman Garmacy, who became interested in why it was that some children whose parents suffered from mental illness still seemed nevertheless to do well despite the difficult circumstances they faced. And the results pointed very much to resilience. So with the current government focus on mental health as well as physical health, we feel again that resilience is probably likely to attract further attention from researchers and practitioners alike because of the positive benefits associated with it.
Okay, in terms of kind of moving on to some of the kind of the media clips in terms of sport, business, and the military. So this is an example from sport, and this is where I guess it's interesting to see how the media portrays resilience. In this particular quote, they talk about a special resilience, and actually this is where there's a discrepancy between the media and actually what resilience actually is. There's a lot of, been some research by a lady called Anne Maston who talks about resilience as being ordinary magic. Individuals and teams using ordinary, usual, normal resources rather than it being special as illustrated in this quote. So actually that's where the difference is. It's not something that is special. It's a common phenomenon, resilience, and it's not just a few individuals or teams that possess it. You know, research does suggest it's an ordinary, normal resources that individuals and teams possess. So that's just an example from sport.
And sticking with the media again, from a business perspective and how it's portrayed, it's certainly becoming an everyday word because it helps portray a picture, I suppose, about what is required for individuals, groups, organisations to withstand the pressures they face. So whether it's a volatile economy, job uncertainty, recessionary pressures, and we all know that workplaces can be tough places to be right now. But we think, again, resilience is quite distinctive in that it's regarded as a progressive phenomenon. And we like this because it helps illustrate how it's much more than just a quick fix to challenging encounters and situations that we all face. It's much more about a sustained, longer-term positive adjustment.
And in terms of developing resilience, there's been actually quite a lot of investment, as you can illustrate it from this particular newspaper article, from the military, particularly with the US Army. And they've developed something called the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program, looking at psychological fitness, and in particular a program that is called Master Resilience Training. It's been done with the University of Pennsylvania, being headed up by Martin Seligman, very renowned professor in positive psychology. And actually some of the material we'll be talking about today draws from some of this material. So a good example of actually how resilience training or the development of resilience has been applied in practice.
And in summing up the importance of resilience, and to sum up really the first part of this webinar, the key message from us is that resilience matters, whether it's, as I said, a deep recession in business or facing adversity in sport or during potentially traumatic personal circumstances. And we know again that many individuals, groups and organisations are actually able to experience benefits during adversity and challenging encounters by being able to positively adapt, improvise and unlearn and relearn, reinvent themselves and so on. And I suppose contrary to the message on this slide, we actually don't agree necessarily that it's more than education. It's arguably because of education that resilience can be developed. And again, there's no doubt that those working with individuals and teams increasingly want people who are able to respond positively to change, can deal with uncertainty, and can see the big picture during difficult periods. And I suppose, again, although resilience research suggests that it emerges, as Mustafa pointed out, from ordinary human adaptation systems, it doesn't mean or follow that understanding resilience is simple, and that the task actually in implementing resilience can be challenging. And turning now to what is resilience? Well, most definitions incorporate two main conditions. That's both exposure to adversity or risk and the attainment of positive adaptation or competence, essentially doing well. And definitions emphasize often the protective and shielding nature of resilience from, importantly, the potentially negative consequences of stressors or obstacles, hurdles that we face. Resilience is often regarded again about the maintenance and ability to function in a relatively stable way or experience minimal disruption to stressors. Lately, the process view of resilience has tended to be favoured, and that's regarded very much then as a capacity developed over time as individuals and groups very much interact with their environment. And here, resilience involves a continuous anticipation and adjustment in the face of adversities. So for example, in our research in elite sports teams, participants would often comment that it can be conceived of and mean different things in different circumstances, and it can change over time. Athletes would often comment such as, it depends on what time of the season it is, and it's very much like riding a roller coaster. Importantly, resilience, therefore, if it's regarded as a process, the research shows that it can be developed. And finally, research is showing that resilience is a more proactive influence to managing stressors. For example, again at the team level, our research illustrated how elite teams felt that they were able to utilize their collective strengths and resources to protect the team against the potential negative impact of setbacks. So importantly, it's something that can be planned for.
Actually, just building on from Paul's point there, actually there's a lot of media and anecdotal accounts of what is resilience. A lot of people talk about resilience as bouncing back. And it's a term that we don't really agree with, and again it's very well illustrated in this particular quote. And it's particularly the case for those who are operating in high-performance environments, in sport and business, for example, where it's not about just responding to a setback, it's not about bouncing back from a crisis. It's, as Paul said, it's about the capacity to change before the case for change becomes desperately obvious. It's that proactive nature of it. And it's, I guess, comparing it to something like stress management, whereas stress management can be quite reactive when actually stress is encountered, we see resilience as becoming proactive before the actual potential negative effects of stress occur. So just wanted to put that out there in terms of it. We don't see it as bouncing back. And just on the flip side as well, what is resilience and what it isn't, what is it not? One of the things that kind of come out sometimes is that resilience is a rare or special quality, again similar to that quote from Martin Wenger being special resilience. And again, we would argue that actually resilience is a common phenomenon, it's an ordinary phenomenon, and that normal human resources are developed through this process, and most individuals can be resilient. So it's not the case that it's just for certain individuals or teams. In terms of resilience not being a fixed trait, we don't see it as being a fixed trait. We don't see it as an athlete or a team is resilient or not. You can be resilient in certain situations and not resilient in other situations. So we don't see it as a fixed, stable capacity. Just the third point about it being found exclusively within a person, it links really to the fixed trait bit, that actually it's not actually just found, it's not just an individual trait or an individual quality, capacity that someone has. And actually there is research that suggests that resilient individuals draw on the support of others. So the importance of others, the importance of social support and relationships, particularly in the context of teams, is actually very important. And lastly, sometimes the media and anecdotally people suggest that resilience is the absence and suppression of emotions. That resilient individuals or teams don't show any emotions at all. And again, we think that that's not true at all. Actually, there's a lot of research in resilience research to suggest that emotions are very important, both positive emotions but also negative emotions. And sometimes actually negative emotions are put to a side, and we think that we should suppress these negative emotions. And actually that's not true. It's really quite important to manage those negative emotions and use them to one's advantage. So again, that's not just a few myths there in terms of what resilience is not. Then moving on to the second part of our webinar, really, this is a resilience training program based on, as I said, some of the research that we've conducted in our experiences working with athletes and teams. And the main point, one of the main messages from this program is that we see resilience as being an interaction between the psychosocial qualities that an individual or team possesses and also the environment that they're placed in. So the qualities an individual or team have influences the environment, but also at the same way the environment influences the qualities that are developed. And we see that interaction leads to what we've termed as a challenge mindset, a mindset where individuals and teams see opportunities see pressure as an opportunity for growth, development, and mastery. And what we're going to do now is talk you through these three components, starting off with psychosocial qualities. So at the kind of individual level, and this is some of the research that we've conducted with Olympic champions. We interviewed 12 Olympic champions about how they were able to withstand the pressures in their sporting careers. And we identified 5 psychosocial qualities that underpinned resilience in these particular high-level athletes. And again, just for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on 2 in particular, and I've got some references at the bottom for those who are just interested in this particular research. Firstly, I just wanted to touch upon the notion of developing a positive personality. I guess when people hear of the word personality, it's something that people automatically think, does that mean someone who is extroverted? Does that mean someone who is bubbly and always laughing and always kind of, always at the showing really good positive emotions? And actually, that's not particularly the case. What we mean here by a positive personality is someone who is proactive, someone who constantly seeks out challenging situations, constantly wants to seek improvement, and always wanting to make change and doing things in a proactive manner. The other one I wanted to focus upon was this area of strengthening confidence. I said we could probably do a whole webinar on this particular area, but there's 3 points I wanted to make which is slightly against what maybe some of the research says. First of all, we've not used the word self-confidence here. Actually, some of the athletes that we interviewed said that it wasn't confidence within themselves. It's actually sometimes they had a lot of confidence that arose because of their teammates or their support network. So actually, that's quite an important thing. It's not necessarily self-confidence. The other bit was some of the athletes mentioned that actually throughout their time they weren't necessarily confident throughout their whole sporting careers, and actually this notion of a little bit of self-doubt helps actually was very true. And lastly, there is some research now suggesting that it's not necessarily the level of self-confidence, the level of confidence that's important, but it's whether or not confidence can be stable, particularly when individuals encounter challenging situations. So it's that stability to maintain confidence rather than having high levels of confidence. And that's just something to be aware of here. So I'm just going to pass over to Paul, who's going to talk about it at the team level.
So similar to the individual level, we were really interested in understanding the resilient characteristics or qualities of elite sports teams. And we held focus groups with a number of Olympic, international and professional teams. And we really wanted to explore what a resilient team looks like and what it meant to those team members. And so in our research with the teams, 4 overarching themes emerged. And the first one, which will be nothing surprising to those working with teams, is very much around structure and group structure, which tends to refer to aspects such as formal team structures, group norms, working communication channels. And to illustrate within this particular theme, team members would comment, for example, that reflecting on their shared vision during setbacks helped orientate the team during difficult times. It helped them to withstand the stress and pressures and helped them to maintain their functioning as a group. They often said that they felt during this process that they had sight of the big picture during setbacks. And it was this kind of function that was helping maintain a shared sense of perspective. And we explained this as a form of collective sense-making, if you like, and a shared mental picture of how to actually operate during setbacks. And in other settings such as the emergency services, the military, we tend to see these structural aspects emerge quite often, and a common goal that helps teams organize themselves during a crisis, because it can tend to promote a set of coordinated responses. Mastery approaches refers to developing shared attitudes and behaviors that promote an emphasis on team improvement and learning. So it's very much about ongoing learning and working together to improve as a team during adversity. Interestingly, social capital, certainly the team level, refers very much to the existence of high-quality interactions within groups. And themes included team identity, having caring relationships, and knowing that support would be there from team members during difficult times. So here, team members would describe often how team resilience involved deep bonds between teammates, where you don't want to let the team down and you owe it to them. The theme really illustrated to us the importance of having an emotional attachment and closeness between team members during difficult times. Collective efficacy refers to a group's shared belief in its ability to perform a task. So in our context, difficult tasks and adversity. And this theme included resilient teams having shared expectations and beliefs, competitive fighting spirit and sticking together during setbacks. And based on the research, we felt that and proposed that a resilient team is very likely to be more than the sum of a collection of resilient individuals. We then really, having looked at a little bit at what a resilient team looks like, we then wanted to explore the psychosocial processes that helped team functioning during setbacks and adversity. And we conducted a case study based on the England rugby team, which won the World Cup in 2003. And the results revealed 5 prominent processes underlying their team's resilience. And I'm just going to illustrate a couple of these. Firstly, transformational leadership was a really interesting process that emerged as an important process which helped to build relationships between leaders and followers. And transformational leadership often refers and is defined as the building of those relationships between leaders and followers based on personal, emotional, and inspirational exchanges to enable those followers to reach their optimum potential. So, for example, for the 2003 England team, players often commented how Clive Woodward, the then head coach, was brave enough to think longer term when faced with clear disruption and failure. So, for example, despite failure in the 1999 Rugby World Cup, he continued to be ambitious to focus on the longer term. As part of this process, developing a collective vision, having a shared philosophy, being able to manage change effectively, meant that, as he called it, everyone's noses pointed in the right direction. And a transformational leadership approach meant that the team was encouraged to reflect on the bigger picture during setbacks. Clive Woodward, you would often hear say that during some perceived failures that it wasn't his ambition to be number 1 in Europe, but in the world. So the relevance of this can be explained, as we describe it, perhaps through a process of what's known as perceptual filtering. In practical terms, actually just reinforcing the strategic priorities. What is it the team's trying to achieve during setbacks, and actually communicating that. Secondly, shared leadership was another really interesting process. And this really contrasts with more conventional hierarchical forms of leadership and refers to spreading more leadership amongst more of the team. And again, the study showed that it perhaps helped ensure accountability during setbacks. Clive Woodward said that it wasn't enough for him to have just one leader in a team of followers, but to actually have an exceptional leader in a team of great leaders. And we felt this was reinforced through the use of phrases such as teamship, to symbolize how team members collectively set their own high standards in difficult times. It's been really interesting lately to see some similar developments in the England football team, where players seem to have been encouraged to really engage in more formal player meetings. Perhaps an indication or symbolizing a bit more of a shift to more responsibility being shifted to the players, which hopefully will promote even greater accountability. The key message here from us is that more players are more likely to be on the same wavelength about how to operate during setbacks, and therefore it's more likely that team functioning will probably occur. Social identity refers to team members having a shared sense of we and us during stressors and pressure. So in this study, the team clearly used imagery such as Club England and teamship again to promote a strong team identity. And the role of strong identity for us, for team resilience, might be due to how it really helps facilitate those strong relationships and binds commitment to a shared goal in the team. And again, latterly, and I'm sorry it's rugby union again, but it's really interesting to see how for Stuart Lancaster, the current England head coach, and actually at the weekend, Southampton Football Club, there was a little bit in the press about how they really have placed a lot of emphasis on this process. They've regarded the role of culture and a strong team identity that really emphasises promoting the team above self-interest. And this is absolutely central to their team's development. I suppose overall from this study, the process revealed that it helped us explain how the team resilience of the 2003 England Rugby World Cup champions team really involved the mobilisation of that team's combined resources over some time to help withstand the pressures that they faced. And it also really helped highlight that it is possible to cultivate and develop these as a set of resources that really again helps protect the team from the potential negative impacts of those pressures and failures that they will encounter.
Okay, so we've now talked a little bit about the psychosocial qualities, both at the personal level and also at the team level, and that's obviously the one part of our framework which we think is very important to develop. The second part of our framework we're going to talk about now is mindset. And what we refer to mindset, and again this is how we would potentially talk about it in a practical setting, is about changing one's thought patterns and how individuals and teams view pressure and stresses. And I use this picturing sometimes in my consultancy to show that pressure has two faces. And in terms of the picture on the far right, either a person playing a saxophone or a young woman's face. And in the context of pressure, pressure can either be viewed as a challenge or be viewed as a threat. And what we want for our individuals and teams, particularly in context of resilience, is developing a challenge mindset. I'm just going to talk about one strategy that has been used actually in the military setting and is now starting to be applied in sport as well. So as I mentioned before, challenge mindset is where individuals or teams see pressure as an opportunity for growth, for learning and development. And one of the strategies that have been used to develop this challenge mindset is something called learning your ABCs. And as I said, it's a strategy that the military uses to develop resilience in soldiers. And very briefly speaking, it's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, very much so. So it's not a novel technique particularly to resilience, but in the context of resilience, the A, where it says here on the screen about an activating event, is always been referred to as an adversity. So in the context of resilience, A would be an adversity. And it's about exploring individuals' thought patterns. So, working through activities where an event has happened, an adversity has happened. So in the military, one of the examples that they use is you come home after a long deployment and your partner breaks up with you. If that was a hypothetical scenario, and that's the exact phrasing that they use, and then they talk soldiers through their thought patterns around that. And they work through patterns to explore that actually the event leads to beliefs and thoughts, and those thoughts then lead to consequences in terms of behaviors. And it's getting the goal at the end is for athletes and for teams to understand that A leads to B and B leads to C, rather than A leading automatically to C. So it's getting them to understand the importance of thoughts and beliefs in this whole process. Just moving now on to the third component of the resilience training program, what we've termed a facilitative environment. And very kind of broadly speaking, an environment which is conducive to facilitate resilience. And as kind of the seesaw illustrates, we kind of see it in terms of the environment that is created as a fine balance between challenge and support. And in the context of resilience, I guess we would say that actually having a little bit more challenge than support in terms of facilitating resilience is probably needed. And we're going to just illustrate that in terms of some of the research that we've done. So this was a study that we very recently, it was some follow-up interviews with some of the Olympic champions that we interviewed in that first study, looking at their, where I talked about the psychosocial qualities. We did some follow-up interviews with them to find out a little bit more about some of the adversities that they'd encountered and actually how did that influence their psychological and performance development. And they mentioned that if they hadn't encountered certain stresses, including some quite highly demanding adversities in their sporting careers, in the build-up to them winning their gold medal, they wouldn't have gone on to win their gold medal. And this was just one of the quotes from some of the follow-up interviews. This was an individual who had not been selected for the senior team, as you can see from the quote, not been selected for the senior team for over 4 years. But actually, in terms of his psychological and performance development, as you can see, he saw that as an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to develop. Again, very much a challenge mindset. And again, one of the benefits of actually going through challenging situations, some of the research that, in terms of that particular paper, was around actually increasing an individual's levels of motivation, increasing, actually going through negative emotions, as I mentioned. Actually, you can see the quote here talking about this individual being furious, actually going through negative emotions, and the process of that was also very, very important in terms of the benefits of adversity. And the last bit around learning, which, as I said, it is illustrated in this particular quote. And I'm just going to pass over to Paul now, who's going to talk about some of the benefits of challenge at the team level.
Yeah, so back to teams, the benefits of challenge revealed in our studies really was revealed through the mastery approaches theme that we talked about earlier, which again refers to having ongoing learning and working together to improve as a team. And when discussing their shared experiences of team resilience, Olympic and world champion teams, and here's an example from rowing, they talked about how they managed change really effectively, they felt, during difficult periods, which was important. And they commented on how they were actually able to anticipate and adjust to pressures, in their own words, by preparing themselves to overcome any situation. They really felt that they actually developed what they referred to as a system of responses to those difficult situations, and felt that they had a barrier around them, therefore, which in our terms would be very much about having a protective shield during encountering adversity. And it was really aptly summed up by the participants in the study as simply, we know what to do, we've been there before. And the study showed really also that resilient teams obviously regard setbacks as a natural part of their development, and we suggest that this helps promote a more outward-looking team during setbacks. And resilient teams manage to avoid panic, they manage to freeze, and what the business literature terms as something called threat rigidity, where during maybe a non-resilient team may have a more sort of a panic approach during setbacks, whereas a more resilient team is more likely to look outwards and want to find solutions to those setbacks that they're encountering.
Okay, so in terms of practically, we've obviously talked a little bit practically what you can do, but actually in the context of a facilitative environment, there's been an article kind of a couple of years ago around an individual school that had a failure week. Again, that's just something I'm just putting out there to the listeners in terms of, is there something practically that practitioners can do in the context of sport? Importantly, this was a top girls' school. And I would kind of stress that it's probably creating a failure-friendly environment is probably very important for aspiring elite athletes, purely because successful students or successful athletes don't encounter adversity or failure that often. In the sense that if they're successful, they've always been seen to actually be achieving and doing well. So actually doing it in a top school or in the context of athletes, doing it with top sport performers or aspiring elite sport performers is actually very, very important. And how I would see failure week or a failure week training session or a failure week in the context of sport is giving athletes and teams the opportunities to try things out, the opportunities to experiment, so that without, and the most importantly, without evaluation or judgment, and doing it in a supportive environment. And that's where that challenge and support, that balance is really quite important. Obviously, with this particular one is that it's very important that it's appropriate to the situation, it's appropriate to the age group, etc. But it's creating that environment where failure is actually seen as something where you're pushing your boundaries. The benefits of failure can be that you actually learn from that, you learn how to deal with that, you learn how to react in really difficult times. And that's, if you haven't encountered failure, where it said some high-achieving sportsmen may not have had that much failure in their sporting career, creating their environment where failure is actually encouraged could develop resilience kind of medium to long term. And I said this kind of initiative or these kinds of movements seem to be coming about. This is a movement that is happening, something called Fail Forward, really around sharing stories, and Paul will talk a little bit about that in the context of teams, where this particular campaign or movement is encouraging individuals to share stories, bring people together about conversations around failure as an opportunity, an important part of growth and learning. And I've just provided the website there at the bottom. They've got events at Loughborough and Lancaster universities coming up with a range of speakers from sport and business talking about their failure lessons, successful sports and business people talking about actually how they've benefited from failure, and without that failure they probably wouldn't have been able to succeed. So, provided that website at the bottom if people want to see that. But I'm just now going to pass on to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit about maybe some of the practical implications, a little bit of a caveat as to what practitioners should look out for when they're trying to create this kind of environment, and then moving on to talking a little bit about how to then implement resilience training in practice based on some of his experiences with working with teams.
Yes, so I suppose based on our research and experience, we propose that any intervention is probably best considered in relation to an individual's or team's psychosocial development. So, for example, it's probably best to avoid implementing lots of interventions and rather really just simply try to consider what is it that seems most appropriate at the right time. We know that, for example, at the team level, that things, as they can at the individual level, of course, things can change, things can fluctuate and will change during a season. So it's useful from our point of view to maybe consider the resilience processes that we outlined in relation to the pressures or stress that the team or individuals encountering. Essentially, what is most likely to work when? For example, I suppose hypothetically, if a team had a new coaching team, had low morale, perhaps had been experiencing a prolonged performance slump, our research suggests that perhaps thinking about use of transformational leadership approaches, such as agreeing team protocols and actually referring to those during setbacks, referring to the team's common goal during setbacks, can make a difference. And perhaps in due course, maybe through a shared leadership approach, to illustrate another example of using another process or resource, if you like, by creating a leadership group to help reflect on the benefits of setbacks and to identify future solutions, can also help the team be protected from those potential negative consequences of stress. And we also feel it's really important to allow time for reflection, allow time for people to actually be briefed about the purpose of an intervention and its potential benefits, and to absolutely emphasize that it's not a quick fix and part of a very long-term process of developing a culture of excellence, certainly in the sport sector. So to assist with this, we've suggested encouraging athletes, for example, to reflect on the new knowledge that they've gained from setbacks and failures, what have been the benefits, and how would they apply this during future setbacks. And we also feel that framing an intervention around embracing challenge, being ambitious, setting high expectations and learning is probably really important at the outset to help promote this kind of resilient culture where individuals and teams do view setbacks as a natural part of their development. Again, going back to Clive Woodward, one of the things he did was provide a great example of this, where during the early phase of his team's development, he said that he wanted his players to think differently and to play differently, and as he called it, play without numbers on their backs. And here he was referring to sort of learn to play what was in front of them and not be constrained or feel that they have to be constrained by traditional roles and positions. So to put it another way, he simply was committed to innovating and looking outside of his sport for ideas and for creativity. And in our view, that all of that helped really promote a resilience building approach. So in terms of things that could be considered in actually implementing resilience practice in training in practice, there's just a few suggestions here. Certainly, as Mustafa said, actually formally holding open and frank discussions about resilience. One thing we know from the research is that a constant theme in today's webinar has been about maintaining a critical sense of perspective. It's really important during setbacks to hang on to that perspective. So holding some open discussion here can contribute well. And again, at the team level, we found that encouraging team meetings offered a structured approach to discussing their shared experiences of resilience, and we felt that it was certainly helping lead a more proactive approach to identify solutions for themselves. To illustrate, one of the solutions from these types of meetings has been in the past using more simulation training to be more exposed to setbacks in training evenings, training sessions, and to actually practice those solutions on a regular basis. Similarly, perhaps asking a leadership group to create a group and engage in ongoing discussion about how they, as a group, might withstand the setbacks that they typically encounter. And again, in our experience, athletes, team members enjoy having that sense of responsibility. They want to take, very often, an interest in those solutions. And interestingly, some of these points have resonated with a research paper recently by Ken Hodge and Graham Smith. And Graham Smith was the former World Cup winning coach of the New Zealand All Blacks, again, unfortunately in rugby union, who referred to the creation of a dual management model, which he quite deliberately employed following various critical incidents and key incidents in their team's development. I suppose we found it obviously helps implement resilience training when a practitioner does have a recognised place in the team, and where that practitioner has really also thought hard and deeply about the context that he or she is in. And this all takes time, but it does really help understand what's going to be likely to work with which persons and in which situations. And again, in our experience, I'm sure from a lot of practitioners' experience here, that there's certainly in my view, there's a need probably to try and adopt an approach where one can show rather than tell. For example, in teams, the word it doesn't take long for the word to get round when things are working or when things are not working. As ever, though, developing good relationships with individuals and team members can really be an important aspect of effective resilience interventions, as the case is for any other type of topic. And resilience interventions can be assisted over time by perhaps simply being around, generally helping out, even when not necessary, and showing an interest in the team or individual's development. And that might be even more the case during setbacks, because failures and setbacks are pretty sensitive times. So it's when relationships become pretty fundamental to resilience interventions. So I suppose overall, Mustafa referred to Anne Maston, who is a pioneer of resilience research, and as she suggests, to help guide practitioners, a common question in resilience research is this system doing what it's supposed to be doing, and is this system developing well? And to just use that as an initial assessment. Excuse me. So I suppose to conclude, we are recommending here that the development of resilience is probably best framed, from our perspective at least, as part of a longer-term cultural change, rather than a series of one-off, short-term quick fixes. And for those implementing resilience training, we think it's probably best approached framed that way, that's a proactive catalyst for changing the culture when encountering adversity and stress. And in this article by Casey, it's focused on the US Army, he outlines how their aim in implementing resilience training was to move away from what he called a treatment-centric approach to one that focuses on prevention and one which builds on one's strengths. And this for us really resonates with that constant theme found in resilience research, which is to strive for change before the case for change becomes desperately obvious. And of course, it's always wise to acknowledge this will take time. It is messy, but in our experience and what we've actually discovered in the resilience literature, it's well worth the effort and can result in really strong individual and collective psychological benefits. Okay, so we've got a couple of slides just on references, and I suppose in terms of more practically orientated references, there are some here very focused on the business literature, so by Kutu and Hamel and Valek-Kangas. There are two references there very much about the business setting. There are 2 or 3 references focused on the sports setting, so Sarker and Fletcher and Schinker and Jerome. And there's also there a reference for those interested in the military context. Martin Seligman has, there's a nice article on building resilience in Harvard Business Review.
And so for those from, I guess, the academic background and wanting to find a little bit more in terms of the research side, just a few references here. So the first 3 references are around looking at both psychological, kind of personal resilience and team resilience in the sporting context. The fourth reference is a paper that we've done looking at resilience in high achievers, across a range of performance contexts. So 11 different performance contexts: sport, business, law enforcement, politics, entertainment, and looking at about how they were able to thrive in real kind of pressured environments. And then the 5th reference that we've just very briefly talked about was looking at the benefits of adversity, and actually to say that actually going through adverse related experiences is actually vital in the development of superior Olympic performance. So just a few academic references both in the sport and performance context for those interested in terms of some of the research literature. And we've just put here just a few few contact details. If you want to get in touch, we'll obviously answer some questions now, but if your question has not been answered, please feel free to get in touch over email or Twitter. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen today. And as Graham said, the webinar will be available to record afterwards if you do want to listen. But thank you very much for those who have come and spent an hour of your time in the afternoon. And I think handing over to Graham now to pick out a few questions for us to answer.
Right. Well, we've had plenty of, well, more than enough questions. I have, in fact, just sent out a message saying no more, please. But anyone who does have a question that they've not already submitted, as Mustafa and Paul just said, their contact details are there, and they will be happy, within reason, to answer your questions directly. Okay. So, firstly, we have a question from Ben Oakley at the Open University here in the UK. And he asked, to what extent do you think childhood events and or parent motivational climate contributes to resilience in sport?
Thank you very much, Ben, for that question. I'll give it a go at answering that one. Interestingly, around the childhood events, actually, I'll pick on that particular aspect. So in the research that we did, where we looked at, where we did those follow-up interviews with those Olympic gold medalists, there were 2 childhood events that came out in terms of quite adverse childhood events that happened in their sporting careers that they said were really essential in terms of their development. One of them was actually a number of the athletes mentioned that one of their parents got divorced during the time they were competing for the Olympics, and one of the athletes mentioned how that event drove them on in terms of their development. It really, kind of in terms of, it was a darker side of motivation where they wanted to prove to their mum that she was a high achiever. So actually, in terms of these kind of quite potentially traumatic event there, really drove them on and actually helped them to focus in terms of their sport. Another one that was mentioned was actually a death of a parent. That was actually mentioned by quite a few of the athletes. And again, there, in terms of their motivation, really enhanced it. And sort of a slightly darker side than the usual kind of view of motivation as being something that, you know, intrinsic motivation being something that's better. They actually had quite strong extrinsic motives where it actually worked in their favor. So yes, childhood events can contribute to resilience in sport, certainly. Yeah, I hope that's answered that one.
Okay. John Marchant, Senior Sports Psychologist at Sport Scotland, asks, can you measure resilience?
Interesting one. The million-dollar question, actually, about how can you measure it. It's actually been, funnily enough, part of my PhD in terms of the measurement of resilience. I've spent 3 years doing it, so I'll try to condense my answer in about 10, 15 seconds. Yes, you can measure resilience, is kind of my short answer. My slightly longer answer is that a lot of the resilience measurement scales at the moment that have been developed, and in the research literature, there's around between 15 and 20 scales that have been used. I would argue that probably they're not specific to sport. Actually, part of my PhD was actually looking at developing a measurement in the sporting context. So yes, you can measure it. The measures that are out there focus very much on resilience or resilient qualities. They focus very much on those kind of psychological characteristics which are important in terms of resilience, but they don't actually focus on the process side of things. So I think you can measure it, but the measures that are out there aren't always adequate in terms of looking at resilience as something that changes over time, that actually has an individual encountered adversity. Do we know that through current resilience scales? Probably not. So yeah, you can measure it, but the ones out there aren't brilliant, and hopefully in the next kind of year or two there will be one in the sporting context. But yeah, no, thank you very much for that question, John.
Okay, Hugh Gilmore in Ireland asks, what applied actions would a practitioner implement to facilitate the development of resilience?
Yeah, I'll take that. Thanks for the question, Hugh. So, I mean, hopefully some of the things that we mentioned give a few ideas. I mean, I tend to, in terms of the research, thinking about the characteristics, so what does a resilient team look like, and then thinking about the processes that we covered very briefly as a set of, combined resources really, if you like, is from my perspective quite a nice place to start. So in terms of team resilience, I suppose an overall message again is just to think about the nature of the stress or setbacks or obstacles that an individual or team in this case is facing, and then which of those resources might seem most appropriate, or what strategy might be most appropriate to think about developing some practical ideas. So, I talked a little bit about shared leadership. So, as a good example there as a process that could be, a practical set of strategies could be developed around that one process. Forming that leadership group as an example, asking that leadership group to reflect on the benefits and to discuss that with other team members. Through empowering leaders in the team to discuss their experiences of resilience, and hopefully it will promote further accountability and actually enjoyment, because that's the kind of challenge mindset that I'm sure a head coach or a practitioner is hoping to instill in the team during those moments. I suppose in terms of, to give a different example, team learning is something that again emerged through the research as pretty vital for team resilience. And some of the things that might work might be, we use a lot of performance analysis, but to what extent can we also think about utilizing performance analysis to not only for technical aspects, but also for psychological ones. So it might be looking at it from a different perspective. What happened when the team conceded a score in the first 30 seconds? Is there stuff to be gleaned from use of video, for example, and to form some learning strategies around what they have seen through video work? I suppose one final applied action, we talked a little bit about simulation training and use of what-ifs and being more exposed in training to appropriate setbacks and stressful situations. I'm sure is something that practitioners often would use, and from our perspective it can be a really useful approach to, and practical, something that players want to actually practice, so that they feel more exposed and more used to confronting those different types of difficult situations during a game, or even how to react after a match.
Okay, Cara Gianetto from, I think it's Yavapai College in Arizona, asks if you have any suggestions for steps that coaches or teachers might take towards integrating this skill training into regular training sessions.
I think from a sort of maybe moving from a teaching perspective, it's really fascinating. Mustapha, highlighted the increasing role of, talked about the girls' school that's adopted a failure-friendly week, about how they're embracing studying setbacks and discussing experiences and shared experiences of setbacks and failure. I suppose I've tended to adopt using the findings from, again, the research on resilient characteristics as a basic framework. So, for example, a coach might and the teacher might actually devise some strategies based around mastery attempts, successful mastery attempts in previous setbacks. And there's a wonderful video that on YouTube from Carol Dweck that many people will be very familiar with in the sports psychology world, about what she called the power of yet. And I thought it had a really fitting link to resilience research about promoting more of that mastery approach during setbacks. So I suppose, for example, in the sporting context, a coach, we talked about might ask participants to discuss the benefits of recent performance slumps. It might take a while to get the conversation going. We talked a bit about reflection on setbacks and failures and using those for future occasions. For teachers, it might be, I think as Carol Dweck highlights in her video, consider the actual use of praise following critical incidents to help raise that awareness of reinforcement of what's going on during withstanding obstacles that again, we all face. And I thought Mustapha's example of the girls' school with that failure week was really interesting. The emphasis on being placed on actually having a go rather than playing it safe, and perhaps, as they call it, achieving less. So there's one or two ideas there. I think from our team level research, we've also found that it's been interesting to see the use of particular mantras and mottos and themes that can help maintain teams, for example, to stick together during setbacks. That England Rugby 2003 team, really had a mantra around learn from it and move on. And you could see how it became just built into the team's core mission. And similarly, I think we're seeing similar things from the current team. So I suppose the key thing is a vision is nothing new about teams. It's actually, for us, what's interesting has been how resilient teams seem to use and refer to the common goal and their mission and vision to remind them of that bigger picture during those difficult times.
Right. Well, Chris Wagstaff from the MSc Sport and Exercise Psychology group at the University of Portsmouth has sent me a whole raft of questions, but I'll just put this one to you if that's okay. And he asks, if team resilience fluctuates over time, to what extent could other factors be important for team resilience, and how will research deal with these?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Chris, for that question. I suppose the answer that I would propose at this stage of our research is perhaps to consider, in terms of those changes fluctuating during a season, to actually map those types of stresses or pressures that they're encountering, and again match the resources that we feel may be most likely to facilitate team resilience at the right time in accordance with that particular situation that the team is encountering. So that for me would be, quite certainly for me personally, quite an interesting way of actually helping to think about a more dynamic set of resources that can accommodate change over time. So for me, those characteristics, those processes offer a starting point at a kind of a way to actually think about those as being a set of resources in relation to different temporal aspects or that a team is bound to encounter during a season.
Just going to kind of build up from that, Paul, is that one example that we found in the team level research, and we've mentioned it, was, let's say, that the two processes of transformational leadership and the process of shared leadership. So what we found with the 2003 England rugby team was that particularly in the early stages of their development, the transformational leadership processes were particularly important with Clive Woodward. And actually, as the team developed, leading towards the 2003 World Cup, shared team leadership became more important. That's potentially how things may change over time. What we kind of interpreted was that there was an ebb and flow between transformational and shared leadership. There were certain times where transformational leadership were more important, and as I said, when the team were developing, there was shared leadership. Particularly, I think there was one of the quotes from one of the players where they towards the end, and I think potentially actually this was in the final where Clive Woodward came in, and actually the players said, "Look, we don't need you. We've now got it. We've now got it between ourselves." So yeah, I think that's just a kind of a more in terms of an example of where potentially those processes can change and develop over time.
And actually, just to follow on again, I'm so sorry to everyone that it's so rugby union focused, but it just happens to be the sport where much of our research has been conducted. But it's a great point, because it was very interesting that Ken Hodge and Graham Smith's research paper, and particularly in a way because Graham Smith, obviously was another Rugby World Cup winning coach, but quite independently in two different time frames, seemed to very much refer to, as Ken Hodge called it, that dual management model. Is a great way of supporting Mustafa's point there, that in previous failures, I think it was 2007 World Cup, 2003 World Cup, they really felt that over quite a long period of time in the New Zealand team's development, that the role of that leadership group and the way that they were able, as Mustafa said, were able to ebb and flow between the head coaching team and those core players became a very important, a really good example of how things can change over time, and it does take time and it is messy, but the two processes tended to complement each other very, very well.
Okay, Karen Weeks how do you differentiate between resilience and mental toughness?
Thanks, Karen, for that. Interesting question. Probably not going to go into a huge amount of detail here. It is quite obviously a messy area between these two terms. Yeah, probably. I mentioned very briefly what some of the research suggests, but as I said, potentially if you just email us, it might be a better way in terms of going into in a little bit more detail. But some of the initial research suggests that mental toughness is very much focused on both positive, and Daniel Gucciardi has commented on this, where he says that mental toughness focuses on both positive pressure and negative pressure, whereas resilience, technically speaking, is more on these negative events. Whether or not that's the case, we've sort of highlighted in some of our work that actually there are some positive events and positive pressures where actually you need to be resilient. So not quite sure. That's something that Daniel Gucciardi argues, but you know, some of our resilience research says there are some kind of positive events, such as, you know, let's say you won an Olympic gold medal. There is then that expectation in the future Olympics. So that's one example where potentially can be differentiated. Another potential way is that resilience seems to be, and again based on the literature, a little bit more dynamic, a bit more process orientated, whereas mental toughness has generally tended to focus on characteristics that enable individuals to, you know, overcome and enable individuals to cope and deal with pressure, whereas resilience tends to take a more dynamic approach. But as I said, it's a very, you know, very messy area. The other thing to mention actually, doesn't really answer the question as such, but mental toughness research has very much focused or started in sport, whereas resilience research has been going on for the last 30, 40, 50 years. So actually in terms of the foundation and the development of the area, there seems to be a lot more in terms of resilience, and actually we in the sport world are only starting to uncover some of that stuff, whereas the mental toughness research has very much started off in sport rather than being elsewhere. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a few details there, but as I said, not you know, still a very complicated kind of distinction between the two, I guess.
Okay. Caroline Heaney asks, how important is resilience in coping with sports injury?
So yeah, sport, yeah, very, very important actually. As I said, one of the adversities actually that we identified in our follow-up study with the Olympic gold medalists was a serious, significant injury in their sporting careers, to the extent that some of the athletes said that their injury potentially would have, they were very close to being ruled out for the Olympics because of their injury. There was particularly one individual who, you know, a few weeks before the Olympics was touch and go whether or not that person was going to make it, but actually used that as a bit of a motivation to actually get back. And actually, I said he went on to win his gold medal. There's one example that is cited in the press actually about Ian Thorpe. I think a few weeks before his Olympics, he did something to his ankle, and actually what he used, and this is where Paul's talked about having a bit of an outward focus, thinking slightly differently, was he thought that I've done something to my ankle. I can't now do any kind of training around my lower end of my body. So he started working on his upper body, and actually found that I think he mentioned that if he hadn't encountered that injury, he probably wouldn't have gone on to win that medal because of the kind of the situation where he was now had better upper body strength, because it forced him to work on that area. So certainly injury is a big topic in terms of resilience. Funnily enough, actually, it's not been researched specifically. We know that injury is one of the events where resilience is required, but actually the intricacies with that we don't know a huge amount about. But yeah, but certainly it is an event where resilience is definitely required.
Yeah, and there's actually sorry, Graham, just to follow on from Mustafa there. For those interested, there's a couple of references to injury in a paper by Nick Garley and Robin Veely, who published a paper in 2008. And again, if people haven't got that or can't find it, they could email us for a copy. And there are a couple of examples of the role of resilience in American athletes talking about their experiences of injury and their role in helping, for example, them come to maybe a perception or a feeling that they gain some perspective or additional kinds of strengths during that injury process. So anyway, just thought I'd mention that there's a paper there that should people be interested.
Okay, how do you feel about answering the question on ballet dancing? I can forward the question to you. I can just bounce it off you. Jesse Garcia wonders, has there been any research done with resilience in professional dance companies? She said, I work with world-class professional contemporary ballet dancers, and one thing that seems to unfold is the competitiveness within the company itself among some dancers, and I'm interested in how I might be able to introduce resilience education to this setting. Is that one for later?
No, but we can answer that simply in the sense that we're not aware of any research done in that kind of dance setting. Definitely there in terms of if you're interested in doing that, please, definitely there needs to be some research in that particular performance context. So yeah, it's kind of quite a simple answer there. No, there hasn't been any, and there definitely does need to be.
Right. Luke Dennison asks, how would you build resilience in a group of athletes going through any unexpected bad form in order to prevent them thinking the next game will then be the same? You may well have answered this in the plan A, B and C slide, I don't know, but I'll put it to you anyway.
Yeah, I suppose in our experience, and again based on the research, I would see it as an opportunity. It doesn't feel like that at the time if you're working with athletes, but because it can be, as I said earlier, quite sensitive, quite difficult time. But it is an opportunity, and again, thinking of those characteristics, those processes, or other means, it is an opportunity to nevertheless go through that kind of collective sense making. And I think like anything, whether it's business, education, or other settings, the military, I'm sure, the more people have those open and frank discussions, but actually with a view to how can you gain what new knowledge has been gained, and therefore what solutions are available. Whatever happens next, it's at least following a more progressive, more positive approach. And it probably then will take time. I mean, I certainly feel that it sometimes just takes time for people to appreciate the strengths they're developing during those, what seems at the time, really tough circumstances. And it can be sometime later, very often, that different people click at different times. They look back over the duration of a season and think, goodness me, how did we get through that? And actually it was quite planned. And it was just helping put a bit of a system in place without maybe overdoing it. Because certainly, again, in our experience, athletes won't want to spend all of their time dwelling or reflecting, but it's certainly important to learn from it, move on, and help be a bit of a critical friend in the background.
Right. This is from Stephen De Cruz. Do you think that a resilient team, that's one that's structured and orientated toward mastery with pro-social behaviour, can assist to develop an individual's resilience?
Sorry, Graham, I think I caught the first part, but I might have just missed the second part there.
Right. I'll go through it again. Do you think that a resilient team, structured, orientated toward mastery with pro-social behaviour, can assist to develop an individual's resilience?
If I'm interpreting the question correctly, then hopefully it'll be of some use in some of the things that we've described earlier. There are, if we're talking about an individual within a team context, that was the bit that I wasn't quite sure of there, then again, from our experience, the research tends to suggest that a team is obviously made up of individuals ultimately, and that in the team context, those the synergies that can be spread amongst a group can be pretty powerful. So it's very likely, the research suggests, that simply being in that group setting can influence how an individual may respond to setbacks. And again, social identity theory and processes really helps us explain that, because regardless of an individual's preferences or maybe about how they may individually behave during setbacks, it is nevertheless, in the team setting, that common goal that binds everybody together. So whether that individual then goes into a different context, perhaps we don't know. Whether it has some transfer to some, beyond their team context is something for research yet to probably suggest within the sports setting. But yeah, it probably goes both ways.
And just kind of building on from that, as Paul mentioned in kind of one of his earlier points, that actually, yeah, as Paul said, it does go both ways. Particularly, but it's something to be kind of think about is that, particularly at the team level, just because you've got a team of resilient individuals doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a resilient team. Definitely a resilient team may mean that you might have, the team resilience may influence individual resilience. Individual resilience will certainly influence team resilience. But the point being that what some of our research showed that there is a distinct element to team resilience. Just because you have a collection, let's say in a football team, a collection of 11 resilient individuals, doesn't necessarily mean the whole team is going to be resilient. So that's just something to be aware of, that team resilience is distinctly different individual resilience, and it's not just putting all these individuals together and that's it. You've got a team resilience. It is there are team level resilience specific characteristics and specific processes which aren't there on the individual level that practitioners need to be aware of in terms of its development. So just thought I'd mention that as an additional point.
Okay. Sophie Walton says, you mentioned the dual management and creating a leadership group within a culture. Once this leadership group is established, do you have any advice on how to play a role in developing team culture and team identity?
Well, I'd certainly, you'll find that paper by Ken Hodge and Graham Smith really interesting. What seemed to, in their research, what seemed to happen was at one point in the team's development, and I think probably quite a similar theme in the 2003 England team. At one point, there was certainly a positive attempt to formalise that structure, but what they found over time, and I think probably as it matured as a process, that once they bedded in the fact that there is a leadership group here and they are discussing and thinking about solutions to encountering setbacks and future setbacks, then what seemed to occur was that as it matured, there became less need, they felt, for holding very prescribed, formalised set times for meetings. It just simply became, as part of their cultural development, a very natural, as they called it, ongoing conversation. But the important bit for me, and again we've seen it through our own experiences, is that once you've, in terms of creating that culture, it's about obviously starting it somewhere and having some explanation of what you're trying to do and the role of it during setbacks. But actually, as it matures, it will become a natural part of that culture, and maybe from time to time it may need revisiting and sort of seeing how things are progressing. But it does tend to be something that becomes a natural part of a system and a culture.
I think, thank you very much everyone for your quote. I think just looking at the time, it's kind of coming up to 4:15 now, so we'll probably just take one more, Graham. One more question.
We actually have two. Could you fit two in?
Yes, can fit two in.
Yeah. We'll just do them quickly. Jordan Shirley asks if you have any examples of delivering this program in a person-centered approach.
Probably, we probably need a little bit more clarification on that in terms of what exactly do you mean by a person-centered approach?
Okay, well I think Jordan's still logged in. If you are listening, perhaps you could email either Mustafa or Paul and just clarify exactly what the question actually is. Finally, we've got Grigori Viklav, I hope I've said that right, who's an independent consultant from Poland, how to facilitate development of resilience among athletes with disabilities. Do you see any potential differences from what you've described in your presentation so far?
Really interesting question there. There will certainly be differences. Actually, there's been some bit of research in the journal Qualitative Health Research, looking at resilience in those who have had spinal cord injury. Again, please feel free to email us for that particular paper. We haven't got it on the slides, unfortunately. It's really difficult to speculate. I wouldn't want to speculate because in terms of sport, there isn't been any research. So I'd be making kind of guesses. But yes, I would imagine with that particular context, and that's something really important in terms of resilience, is that it is very much context specific. Even in the case of, let's say, individual sports or team sports, even within that kind of boundary and that kind of grouping, there are going to be differences regarding what sport. So, and particularly in the case with disability, yes, I know I haven't answered your questions in terms of specific details, but that particular paper looking at resilience in athletes with a spinal cord injury might be useful, and yeah, certainly there for more future research in that area. So please feel free to, or please do. Yeah, that's an area that certainly there needs to be more research in.
Okay, if you could just whiz on to the final wrap-up slide here. I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'd particularly like to thank Mustafa and Paul. I've found it very informative, and I'm sure that you have. Before you, when the webinar finishes today, I would ask that you take a few moments just to complete the short survey. It's only 5 short questions, and it gives us feedback so that we know what's working and what you want to see in the future webinars from us. As I said previously, everyone who's registered or attended will receive a link telling you when and where today's presentation is available for viewing. Feel free to pass it along to friends or colleagues if you think it would be of value to them. And finally, I'd just like to thank you again for your participation today. I look forward to speaking to you again at future BASES webinars. We do have some in the pipeline, I think, for 2015, so please watch your emails or go to the BASES website. You'll get details in due course. Finally, thank you once again for attending, and I wish you well for the rest of your day. Bye-bye.